1. Smothered pork chops with onion gravy. Number 1. Smothered pork chops. And this dish is the perfect entry point into 1950s black home cooking because it demonstrates the central technique that defines so much of this food, the smother. You took bone-in pork chops, thick ones, seasoned them heavily with salt and black pepper and garlic powder, dredged them in flour, and seared them in a cast iron skillet with lard or Crisco until both sides were deeply golden brown. Then you pulled them out, built a gravy in the same pan, sliced onions cooked down in the drippings until they were soft and caramelized and nearly melting, flour stirred in to absorb the fat, stock or water added gradually while you scraped up every bit of the fond from the bottom of the pan. And then the chops went back in, submerged under that gravy, the lid went on, and the whole thing cooked over low heat for another 45 minutes to an hour until the pork was completely tender and had absorbed the flavor of everything around it and the gravy had thickened into something dark and silky and so deeply flavored that you needed bread just to deal with it properly. The smother transformed a tough, inexpensive cut into something that tasted like it had been labored over for days. In the 1950s, smothered pork chops appeared on black family tables from Sunday through Wednesday because they were one of those meals that actually got better as the week went on and the leftovers were reheated in that same gravy. 2. Stuffed bell peppers with rice and ground meat. Number 2. Stuffed bell peppers. And this was a 1950s black household staple that represented the decade's particular genius for stretching a small amount of protein into a complete, satisfying, visually impressive meal. You took large bell peppers, green ones, because green bell peppers were cheaper than the red and yellow varieties that wouldn't become widely available until later decades, cut the tops off, cleaned out the seeds and membrane, and blanched them briefly in boiling water to soften them slightly. The filling was a mixture of cooked rice, ground beef or ground pork or a mixture of both, diced onion and celery cooked down in a little fat, a can of tomatoes or tomato sauce which in the 1950s was one of the great conveniences available to the home cook, salt, black pepper, garlic, and Worcestershire sauce. The peppers were packed with that filling, stood upright in a baking pan with a little water or tomato sauce in the bottom, and baked in the oven until the peppers were completely tender and slightly collapsed and the tops of the filling had browned and the whole kitchen smelled like something wonderful. 1 stuffed pepper per person was a complete meal. A pound of ground meat stretched across 6 peppers fed the whole family. This was the 1950s housewife's particular skill. Making the math work, making the ingredients stretch, and making it look easy and making it taste like you had spent more than you had. 3. Fried corn, fresh corn cut and fried in bacon grease. Number 3. Fried corn. Not cornbread. Not corn on the cob. Fried corn, and this is a dish that has almost completely vanished from the American table and whose disappearance is a genuine loss. You took fresh ears of corn in the summer when they were at their peak sweetness, and instead of boiling them or grilling them you cut the kernels off the cob with a sharp knife, then took the back of the knife and scraped the cob from top to bottom to extract every bit of the milky, starchy corn juice that remained. That juice was the secret. You heated bacon grease in a cast iron skillet until it shimmered, added the corn kernels and all their juice, seasoned with salt and black pepper and sometimes a little sugar to amplify the natural sweetness, and cooked it over medium heat, stirring regularly, until the corn kernels were tender and the natural starch from the corn juice had thickened everything into a slightly creamy, cohesive mixture that was no longer individual kernels floating in fat but something almost like a very loose, very flavorful corn pudding that held together. The bacon grease gave it a smokiness. The corn juice gave it a sweetness and a body that no other ingredient could provide. This appeared on 1950s black family tables as a side dish all summer long, served alongside whatever the main course was, and it was one of those dishes that guests always asked about and always wanted the recipe for and always slightly failed to replicate because the secret was in the scraping of the cob, in the corn juice, and that step is the one everyone skips. 4. Pig ear sandwiches. Number 4. Pig ear sandwiches. And this entry belongs on this list because pig ear sandwiches were a specific and beloved institution of black food culture in the 1950s, particularly in urban areas where black-owned restaurants, lunch counters, and food stands served communities that were excluded from white-owned establishments by law in the South and by practice in the North. The pig ear itself was cleaned and simmered for hours in seasoned water until the cartilage softened and the skin became tender and slightly gelatinous, then pressed flat and either sliced cold or sliced and fried in a pan until the edges crisped up. It went on white bread with hot sauce and mustard and raw onion and sometimes a dill pickle, and the combination of that chewy, richly flavored, slightly gelatinous meat with the sharp condiments and the soft bread was something entirely its own. A sandwich that had a texture and a flavor profile that no other sandwich had, that was unmistakably and specifically a product of the black culinary tradition. In the 1950s South, the pig ear sandwich was sold at black-owned juke joints and roadside stands in small restaurants, and buying one was not just a food transaction. It was a cultural act. It was participating in an economy and a food culture that existed on its own terms, outside the reach of the segregated mainstream, and that was something worth preserving and celebrating and eating. 5. Salmon croquettes with creamed peas. Number 5. Salmon croquettes with creamed peas. And this combination is so specifically 1950s Black American that mentioning it to anyone who grew up in that era or grew up eating their grandmother's cooking from that era produces an immediate, visceral, emotional response. Canned salmon, pink salmon, the affordable kind, not the expensive red, was drained and picked over for bones, though many cooks left the small soft bones in because they were edible and provided calcium and nobody was bothered by them. The salmon was mixed with cracker crumbs or breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, diced onion, black pepper, and sometimes a little hot sauce, formed into patties, and fried in a skillet with oil or Crisco until both sides were golden brown and the outside had developed a crust and the inside was hot and cooked through. The creamed peas alongside were canned peas, and in the 1950s, canned vegetables were not a sign of laziness or low standards, they were a modern convenience that represented progress. Heated in a simple cream sauce made from butter, flour, milk, salt, and pepper. The salmon croquette with its crisp exterior and savory, slightly oceanic interior alongside the sweet, creamy peas and the sauce that ran underneath both of them was a complete, balanced, genuinely satisfying plate of food. It was Friday night food in many households because many black families in the 1950s still observed the tradition of no meat on Fridays. It was the meal that children of that era remember most clearly and most lovingly. 6. Neck bone soup with vegetables. Number 6. Neck bone soup. Different from the neck bones and cabbage of the earlier list, this is the full soup version, the one that stretched a cheap cut of pork across a pot large enough to feed everyone and have enough left for tomorrow. Pork neck bones went into a pot of cold water and were brought slowly to a boil, the gray foam that rose to the surface skimmed away carefully because the 1950s black cook took pride in a clear broth and was not going to serve something cloudy when clarity was achievable with 5 minutes of attention. Then the heat came down to a bare simmer and the neck bones cooked for an hour until the meat was beginning to loosen, and then the vegetables went in. Diced potatoes, carrots, onion, celery, canned tomatoes, whatever was in the kitchen, and the seasoning went in, black pepper and garlic and a bay leaf and salt added carefully at the end. Another hour of slow cooking until the potatoes were soft and the carrots were tender and the broth had absorbed the smokiness and the meatiness of the neck bones and thickened slightly from the starch of the potatoes breaking down at the edges. You served it in deep bowls with cornbread, and the neck bones themselves were the best part. You picked them up with your hands and worked your teeth between the joints and pulled off every bit of that tender, flavorful meat that had been cooking in its own broth all afternoon, and the meat that came off a properly cooked neck bone was some of the best pork you would ever eat. 7. Butter beans with ham and pot liquor. Number 7. Butter beans with ham. Butter beans are large lima beans, and in the black southern kitchen of the 1950s they occupied a place of particular importance because they were substantive enough to anchor a meal on their own, they absorbed flavor beautifully from whatever they were cooked with, and they produced during their long slow cooking a pot liquor, the bean broth, that was thick and starchy and deeply flavored in a way that the pot liquor from greens was not. You started with dried butter beans soaked overnight, put them in a pot with a smoked ham hock or a piece of country ham that had been soaking in water to remove some of its salt, covered everything with fresh water, and let it cook for 2 to 3 hours over low heat until the beans were completely tender and creamy all the way through and the broth had reduced and thickened into something that was more gravy than liquid. The ham hock gave up its smoke and its collagen and its salt and its deep pork flavor over those hours, and by the time the beans were done the whole pot tasted unified and rich and complete. You seasoned with black pepper at the end, maybe a little hot sauce. Served over white rice with the pot liquor poured over everything and a piece of cornbread on the side, this was the meal that a 1950s black family ate on the nights when the budget was tight and the cook was tired and there was no time or money for anything more elaborate. It was also, on those nights, frequently the best thing they ate all week.